This is BBC One.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Nicholas Witchell and Philip Hayton.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. At least 13 dead. Damage running into millions of pounds. The chaos on the day a storm battered southern Britain without warning. A storm with winds that ripped roofs off people's homes as they slept. That blocked roads and railways and blacked out the capital. Tonight, 1 million people are still without electricity. Also, why there was no warning from the weathermen. Who pays for the damage to your house and to your car? Britain clearing up after what the Home Secretary has described as the worst night of disaster since 1945.
Tonight's other headlines: in the Gulf, for the first time a missile has hit a tanker flying an American flag. It's believed to have been an Iranian missile. Our correspondent there says it seems to be a deliberate provocation by the Iranians. President Reagan's wife Nancy is going into hospital tomorrow for cancer tests. The suffering in Sri Lanka, still no sign of a ceasefire. And the rescue around the clock and against it for a little girl down a well.
For 6 hours this morning, southern Britain was battered by the worst storms the nation has known for nearly 3 centuries. They came in from the ocean without any warning from the weathermen. The winds were those of a hurricane. They cut a swathe of destruction from Cornwall to Kent and northwards to London and beyond. The capital and the counties around it were without electric power for hours. Trains were stopped, roads blocked. The emergency services brought every available man and machine into operation. Tonight, the storms have gone, but they've left at least 13 people dead and damage which will cost millions to repair. This afternoon, ministers were called to a special meeting at the Cabinet Office in Whitehall. Afterwards, the Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, said the southeast of England had experienced the worst night of disaster since the end of the war. He praised the efforts of local authorities and rescue teams. The damage was worst along England's south coast. In Dorset, 2 died, firemen crushed by a falling tree. In Hampshire, 1 person died. In Sussex, 3 lost their lives, hit by falling masonry and flying debris. In Kent, 5 died, among them 2 seamen in a ship off Dover Harbour. And London and Berkshire, 1 dead in each. Many others have been injured. Thousands have suffered serious damage to their homes. Later, we'll be seeing how the emergency services coped with a night the like of which they said they'd never known before. We'll be asking why the men from the Met Office didn't know the storm was coming until it was too late, and how the insurance companies will cope with the claims. But first, our reporters tell the story of last night.
Southern England suffered the full fury of the freak hurricane-force winds. In their wake, a trail of devastation, the worst damage to property since the Second World War. Nowhere escaped unscathed. Roofs were completely ripped off blocks of flats and hundreds of homes along the whole of the south coast. Shops were reduced to rubble. At Folkestone, the Sea Link ferry Hengist was blown into the sea wall and ran aground. The 20 crew are safe, but 2 men are still missing off Dover after their ship sank just outside the harbour. At Sheerness Docks, a crane completely toppled over in the high winds. This plane was flipped upside down like a plastic toy. Many people trapped in homes which threatened to collapse had to be rescued by the emergency services. The spirit of the Blitz was abroad, but for some of the elderly, the worst night in living memory was a terrifying experience.
We had 2 people knocked on our door at 2 in the morning. We let them in and they were very frightened. And then about 3:30, the kitchen window went. And then about 15 minutes later, the roof caved in. And my husband was trapped in the chair and so was I. But the other 2 people left. But my husband's disabled and can't walk. So it took me nearly half an hour to get him onto the floor and drag him along to the bedroom at the end, which was still in one piece.
In Dorset, 2 firemen died in their fire engine crushed by a falling tree. These Sussex policemen miraculously escaped unhurt when a tree collapsed on their patrol car. Brighton town centre was battered beyond recognition, littered with uprooted trees. Caravan sites and holiday homes were wrecked, smashed to tinder. Huge tracts of Sussex woodland flattened like matchwood. On the storm-lashed Isle of Wight, coastguards recorded wind speeds of 110 miles an hour, almost twice hurricane force. At one time, the wind speeds went off the scale, too strong to even measure. The famous Shanklin Pier, nearly a century old, was smashed to pieces and swept away overnight. After the biggest storms on record, a glimmer of hope for southern England, the weathermen say that the savage winds that wrought so much havoc are steadily dying away.
The hurricane-force winds which lashed the capital in the early hours of the morning were the worst ever recorded, up to 94 miles per hour. Hundreds of trees were blown down. One man and his dogs had a narrow escape when a tree crashed down in his car near Hyde Park.
Nobody hurt. Dogs rather upset, particularly the thoroughbred, but the little mongrel stood up to it amazingly well.
How about yourself?
Joke, isn't it?
Must have been a bit of a shock.
Just like the Blitz.
The West End took a battering. Some department stores in Oxford Street had their shop fronts blown out. Scaffolding collapsed on cars in Belgravia, but no one was hurt. The only person who died in the London storm was a tramp sleeping rough near Lincoln's Inn. By dawn, the winds were dying down, but the damage remained. Many roads were blocked by fallen trees, and with rail links cut and tube and bus services curtailed, commuters were advised to stay at home. Those who didn't had to find their own way around or through the obstacles. Many got stuck in huge traffic jams on roads into London and the M25 orbital motorway. All day, council workmen have been tackling the huge task of clearing fallen trees and other debris. Most main roads are now open, but it could be days before all side roads are clear. In North London, firemen rescued a woman after a chimney collapsed and fell through every floor of a 3-storey house. She was taken to hospital but wasn't seriously hurt.
We all came out and there was damage everywhere, and apparently she'd fallen down 3 floors. And my neighbour went up to Kentish Town to go and get the police and the fire brigade, and they all arrived, and it was tremendous chaos all night.
All the residents in this block of flats in Lambeth were evacuated when windows and bricks were blown out. It was feared that the building might collapse, but after being examined by experts, it was declared safe. Power failures and the fact that so few city workers made it to work meant that there were almost no deal struck on either the London Stock Exchange or the money markets. Most dealers took the opportunity to go for an early and a long lunch. The picture for homeward-bound commuters is that traffic is moving more freely than it was this morning. London Transport says that about 2/3 of bus and tube services are now running.
At the Suffolk port of Felixstowe, the tanker the Silver Falcon was torn from its berth in a force 11 gale, swept out into the harbour after first smashing into a jetty. The docks were evacuated in case of an explosion. Eventually a tug was able to tow the tanker into Ipswich. At Harwich, the Home Office detention ship, the ferry Earl William, was also out of control in the Stour estuary. Tamil refugees on board had a frightening time as the ship temporarily ran aground before finding a firm anchorage. At Jaywick, 100 caravans were wrecked. Campers were evacuated to a nearby school, damage put at more than £250,000. The camp's amusement arcade reduced to a pile of rubble. On the main roads this morning, drivers weaved their way around fallen trees. A number of lorry drivers were taken to hospital, and a motorist died in an accident at King's Lynn at the height of the gales. On the region's railways, there was total disruption today. It's likely to be 48 hours before the services are fully back to normal. Tonight, the winds, still strong, are slackening, and the clear-up operation is getting into its stride.
The storms left 3 million people in the dark this morning. They had no electricity. In many homes, it was a cold breakfast by candlelight. Trains into London were disrupted. Most had to be cancelled. On the roads, traffic lights weren't working, adding to the chaos. 1 million people are still without electricity tonight, and it'll be several days before full power is restored. The wind blew down power lines and forced power stations to shut to prevent an overloading of the national grid.
For staff at the CEGB's National Control Centre in London, it was a crisis the like of which they'd never faced before. At 4 a.m. they got their first inkling of trouble. Their grid began showing disruptions to power supplies along the south coast. Within minutes, Dungeness power station was completely out of action, along with the cross-channel electricity link from France. Power stations and lines began going down like ninepins. The CEGB say they had no option but to cut off supplies to stop the trouble spreading further north, causing long-term damage to the national grid. By 4:30, they could meet only 10% of the southeast demand.
It is a day that we train ourselves to try and cope with. I believe the people involved have behaved admirably in trying to restore supplies, and it could have been very, very much worse if it hadn't been the prompt action of the control engineers who are actually controlling the minute-to-minute operation.
By the time the Energy Secretary arrived at 9 o'clock to see how staff were coping, along with Board Chairman Lord Marshall, most power stations were back on stream, but the emergency was far from over. The problem now is not with the CEGB, it's with the individual area electricity boards who have the responsibility of getting power to the customer. Given the widespread damage to power lines, some are predicting that particularly in rural areas, restoring supplies to every home could be a matter of days rather than hours. The damaged cables are causing concern for other reasons too.
I would urge the public that if they see a cable or any kind of wire on the ground, do not go near it. Don't touch it, don't go near it. It's possible it could be live, and if they touch it, it'll kill them.
The CEGB are angry they had no prior warning from the weather centre, nor did the emergency services. By 7 o'clock, every single ambulance in London was on the road. Scotland Yard was similarly inundated with 999 calls. This was just one of the 6,000 emergencies the London Fire Brigade had to deal with, more than ever before in their history. They say the first official warning they received of trouble ahead was at 3 a.m. That warning, with terrible understatement, forecast strong winds blowing at anything over 20 miles an hour.
Well, the weather forecasters admit that they got it wrong. They knew a depression was on its way, but they were given no clue as to just how ferocious it would turn out to be. The weather forecast in this morning's Times was typical of what the professional Met men believed. It just predicted an unsettled autumnal look to today's weather. So how was it that they were so wrong?
It took the country by surprise. The question is why? As late as last night, the weather forecast gave little hint of the havoc to come.
Well, that's what the situation was like earlier on this evening. It's associated with this quite deep low pressure area, and a few days ago we thought it would be coming a little bit further west, bringing the strong winds right across the country, but now it looks as though most of those strong winds will stay away, although it's still going to be very breezy up through the Channel and on the eastern side of the country.
At the headquarters of the Met Office at Bracknell in Berkshire, weathermen had seen something was brewing as long ago as last Sunday, but they didn't know exactly what. By noon on Wednesday, the depression in mid-Atlantic seemed innocuous enough. By 6 p.m. it had moved east, warm air from the tropics being forced upwards by cold air from the north, creating a big depression. By 6 o'clock yesterday morning, two centres developed as the depression entered the Bay of Biscay. By noon yesterday, the two centres began to merge, making it more intense. By 6 o'clock last night, the storm had gathered strength. It was now a whirlpool of turbulence. By midnight, the storm centre was west of the Channel Islands. The depression suddenly deepened, whipping up the hurricane-force winds. At the London Weather Centre, a peak gust of 94 miles an hour was recorded on the roof. The wind gauge on the British Telecom Tower measured a gust of 107 miles an hour. Then it broke. The readings just stopped. In a true hurricane, the average wind speed is about 75 miles an hour. Last night's storm wasn't a hurricane, but with gusts over 100 miles an hour, the wind speeds were bordering on hurricane strength. Yesterday, the weathermen were wrong in forecasting which direction the storm would take.
We knew about gales and severe gales getting into Essex and Kent. We knew this was coming, but instead of just Essex and Kent, it meant the whole of southern England.
Experts today defended the Met Office. They said it wasn't really their fault. They didn't see what was coming. This type of depression is notoriously difficult to forecast accurately. It's the way the depression suddenly deepened which caused the trouble. Forecasts depend on weather reports from ships, aeroplanes and weather balloons, released from what's known as upper air stations. Britain has only 8 of these stations, not sufficient to monitor accurately the early changes which would have given longer notice of the storm.
It'll take some time to work out the full cost of last night's havoc. The question is, who's going to foot the bill? Will the insurance companies pay for everything? And who can the local authorities turn to?
This is the scene that thousands of householders woke up to this morning. In Ealing, London's greenest borough, trees lining the streets had toppled in all directions, smashing roofs, chimneys and windows. Since the early hours, council workmen have been sawing people free, a job that'll eat up resources for a long time to come.
It's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks to recover from this. It's going to take an enormous amount of effort and an enormous amount of money, and I hope that we can look to the government to support us in this, because the burden on local ratepayers is going to be enormous.
So far, the government hasn't committed itself on that. But for victims of the storm, the immediate worry is who pays for their damage. At the offices of insurance loss adjusters, the calls have been streaming in. People are asking first if their policies protect them from an act of God like the gales, and then can they go ahead with repairs before the damage is inspected?
They're certainly covered. It is an act of God, but it's one of those acts of God that are covered under the insurance policy. What they should do is to take precautions and do what they can initially to minimize their own loss. If they can get hold of a builder, all well and good. Builders are going to be very busy in the next week or so they should do what they can to protect the roof, sheet it, put polythene bags in the loft, obviously take down anything that's dangerous and hanging. The insurers will stick by them, and they're happy for them to do that. They would far rather they took what precautions they can initially than leave it to become worse.
Hello?
The sheer number of claims means last night's storms will cost insurers dearly. Spring gales 2 years ago brought claims totalling £55 million. So will premiums shoot up next year?
Unlikely. It's not like motor insurance or that type of thing where premiums immediately go up or no claim bonuses are taken away.
As for claims on crushed or battered cars, you are insured as long as your policy is fully comprehensive.
A special meeting of ministers was called at the Cabinet Office in Whitehall this afternoon to discuss the storms. The Home Secretary Douglas Hurd chaired the meeting, which examined how the emergency services dealt with last night's events and discussed how best to ease the problems the storms have left behind.
In Whitehall, several trees had been uprooted, producing a scene reminiscent of the Blitz. When ministers arrived for the emergency meeting at the Cabinet Office, they cheerfully avoided the fallen branches.
Trees blocking the way in.
But there was no doubting the seriousness of the mood when ministers left at the end of the hour-long meeting.
Winds of 100 miles an hour by any standards, which is what they were on the coast, and 94 in the city, represent a severe form of hurricane.
After Mr. Parkinson left, neatly climbing over a fallen branch, there was a news conference at the Home Office.
Well, I've just come from chairing a meeting of ministers in the various departments responsible for handling the aftermath of what has been the worst and most widespread night of disaster in the southeast of England since the war.
Mr. Hurd said that all the public authorities involved had coped resiliently. He wouldn't respond to criticism of the Met Office for not forecasting the strength of the storm. The Home Secretary had been in touch with the Prime Minister in Vancouver, and she had sent her sympathy to relatives of the victims.
Listening to those reports with us at the London Weather Centre is Dick File. Dick, let's leave the recriminations over the forecasting last night. What's happening with the weather tonight?
Well, there is some heavy thundery rain around, which is going to move up into Essex and Suffolk, but there's no likelihood of any further strong winds in the next couple of days, that is in the southeast of England. I must just say one thing though, we did issue a warning early this morning of winds in excess of 70 miles an hour, not 20 as you said earlier on, 70 miles an hour and structural damage. And that was issued about 2.5 hours before the strongest winds in London. So not quite right on that one, but no further gales expected in the southeast. There will be some strong winds in Cornwall, Wales and western Scotland Saturday night and Sunday.
Well, Dick, you say you gave 2 hours warning. I mean, are we saying that it was such a freak last night that you couldn't have seen it coming earlier?
No, I mean, we did issue shipping warnings, including gales, but we didn't get the severity of the storm. The really severe bit from the Isle of Wight through London and up into Essex was a fairly narrow band, and we didn't see the severity of that until just after midnight. And by then, of course, all our warnings were tending to fall on deaf ears, but we did issue them.
Dick, I know you're having post-mortems down there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Yeah.
The wind speeds recorded during the night were the highest ever in the south of Britain, but there have been worse storms. On the 2nd of January 1976, at least 20 people died when winds gusting up to 105 miles an hour hit Britain from Manchester to the south coast. £100 million worth of damage was caused. In October 1881, widespread hurricane-force winds left 108 ships listed missing off the British coast. And 22 years earlier, 400 people died on one ship that went down off Anglesey. But the great storm that struck in November 1703 was the worst of them all. As many as 8,000 people died in Britain and off its coast. 800 houses were blown down and hundreds of thousands of trees were uprooted.